Senator O'Neill.
Thank you, Acting Deputy President. And this evening I rise to put on the record some remarks regarding an amazing program that I know has been operating across Australia in the last several years, established by the Labor government, and it's known as Youth Connections. In the environment of cuts and austerity currently being imposed on the Australian people by this coalition regime, I think it's time here this evening to really talk about how taxpayers' money should be invested, and making sure that we don't throw out the baby with the bathwater at this critical juncture of a transition of government. Since the election, we've heard almost nothing but negativity from the government on the issue of expenditure towards core services, education, health and infrastructure, just to name a few that are of particular interest to me and the region in New South Wales where I live. Instead of positive proposals, we keep hearing about an agenda of cuts. Cuts to health, cuts to education, cuts to welfare, and cuts to vital infrastructure, nation-building infrastructure like the NBN, cuts to public transport, cuts that severely damage confidence and capacity within our society. Parents are worried about how they're going to pay for school supplies after the government rips away their school kids' bonus. Parents and teachers are concerned about school funding after the government's walked away from the Labor Gonski reform agenda. And people are fearful of cuts to Medicare and other health services that are being advised to them now in the lead up to this upcoming federal budget. The notion of being taxed just to see your local GP is causing incredible concern, and communities are angry that vital infrastructure like the NBN is being abandoned in favour of a hopscotch of century-old obsolete copper wire. These cuts are damaging, and they are hurting the community now as well as into the future, and concern is becoming increasingly evident in consumer confidence surveys. The sudden lift on the change of government that is so often the case has withered away very, very quickly. But it's not only the known cuts and the pre-advised cuts that are causing concern, it's the impending cuts that people sense, and there's much uncertainty and angst about this in many parts of the community, particularly amongst those most vulnerable and least able traditionally to participate in civic processes and have their voices heard. The government has refused to release the Commission of Audit, which does, I expect, detail the many horrors it has in store for us, hidden well and truly until after the WA Senate election, in what I would characterise as a cynical act of secrecy that underlines the contempt for the very people that they should be serving and supporting. And my expectation is that such cynicism should and will be indeed punished by voters at the ballot box in Western Australia. I also note that the Coalition stayed quiet on their $500 million cut to the rail line projects in Perth, and I don't think that the community appreciates that silence. It's a silence that must be broken. For the sake of those in the community that the Coalition's secret agenda of cuts will adversely affect, it's time this government stopped treating the public's right to know with the degree of incredible contempt that we've seen in this place day after day. We need access to the plans and figures that this government is working with. They need to be in the open so there can be an informed debate about the priorities of government before the die is cast and the negative consequences of that in community are irrevocable. Labor believes in providing adequate funds, particularly for health, education and infrastructure. These areas give rise to the expression of our core beliefs, which form the founding principles of our party's great social democratic tradition. In government, we put our money into these areas, investing billions in health, education and infrastructure for the benefit of all Australians. And where I live, on the New South Wales Central Coast, the positive impacts and outcomes of these investments are clear. I've heard maligned in this place today the Building the Education Revolution. And I just want to put on the record one more time the way in which those buildings have transformed the experience of schooling for young people who can now gather in places where there were no school halls formerly, where they can gather whether it's raining or not raining to celebrate the successes of their learning, where they can gather the civic community around them to identify talent, celebrate sporting achievements, celebrate cultural achievements, provide space for learning, provide space for community engagement. And in new buildings that replaced ones that students frankly described to me, it was a stinky old building, miss. I'm very glad to have a new place to learn. There's no leaks in this room. That is a transformation of the kind of learning experience that children can have. And the same thing in terms of lifting professional esteem. Our school buildings express in a symbolically powerful way what we value. Proper quality in those buildings on the Central Coast has lifted teachers' perceptions of the nature of their work and the professional status with which they should be, professional status that they should be afforded, and the high esteem in which they should be held. With regard to the Medicare locals, which I know from the Assistant Minister's comments in this place in this last week, all of them are under threat right across the nation. These are agencies that have looked into the community right across Australia and found where the gaps in health provision are, and systematically and carefully gone about filling in those holes in creative and innovative and locally appropriate ways. For example, the Central Coast has a large number of residents who seek retirement there. As they age and they need to move into care, we have a large number of aged care settings and aged care homes available for people to live in. When a person in aged care has a fall of any kind, the likelihood of breaking a bone is pretty high. So in response to that reality, in response to the bed block that was happening at Gosford Hospital, in response to the fact of the distress of moving somebody who's had a fall, who is aged, in an ambulance, unnecessarily using that, getting them to hospital, there's been a massive change, and this is just one program out of the Medicare Local that responded to that reality by funding a mobile radiography van. So if there's an incident, it's reported, and the van goes to the person. They're in their environment where they're comfortable, and this is particularly important for people who might have dementia, just to decrease the stress of the whole experience. This kind of creative response doesn't happen unless somebody is there doing the coordinating work, and it's exactly that kind of work that our Medicare locals are doing. In addition to that, I do want to put on the record that they were the recipient on the coast of $6.5 million in the Partners in Recovery Fund. Now, Partners in Recovery is a vital connecting agency that puts multiple community partners together to wrap care around people who have had severe and long-term challenges in terms of their mental health and well-being. And families and colleagues of people who are receiving this support are frightened, very frightened, that just recently arrived support is about to be ripped out of our community. And of course with the NBN, the hearing on the Central Coast just recently, which was afforded an opportunity for the incredible expertise of business, education, health professionals, international communication experts to come on board and say very, very clearly that the economic opportunities for jobs growth on the Central Coast is going to be cut away by this small-minded, short-term vision of the coalition government by taking away the opportunity of fibre to the premise for every community person, every business, every home, every place in which an aged person wants to age in place and have the security of reliable, not just a little bit faster, but reliable and very speedy internet that gives them the chance to live safely in their context. These are the reforms of government. Politics doesn't sit outside people's lives. It's absolutely deeply embedded in it, and you can see it in those examples that I've given you. We're proud of the reforms that we made in government, but we are deeply concerned by the agenda of cuts that put under threat those particular areas, education, health and infrastructure. And the government seems determined to undo this good work, dismantling reforms, slashing and burning in a vain and petty display of what can only be conceived of as partisan vindictiveness by the people who are receiving the benefit of those programs now. And it seems that the Abbott regime is increasingly being defined in the negative, known for what they're opposing or seeking to dismantle, rather than articulating anything about an aim to support, to build or enable. And today I call on the government to change course, particularly by committing to fund Labor's Youth Connections program beyond the end of 2014. Now, this is an important issue because it does impact on very, very vulnerable young people in our community. The profile of most of the people engaged in this program is young people disconnected from school or work under the age of 17. Under the age of 17, disconnected from school or work. And people who might be listening to this broadcast, and certainly people here in the chamber, cast around in your mind and you know the people that I'm talking about, young people, young Australians who have incredible potential, but sadly might be robbed of the opportunity of connecting with their future because of a failure to fund a program that's helping them make their connections back to work, into work and back to school. From 2010 to 2013, Youth Connections cost a mere $286 million, and this year, $76.8 million. So for under $80 million a year, the Coalition could, if it wanted to, and if it was willing to listen to these young people and the community that's supporting them, they could prove to this place, as well as the nation at large, that they actually care about supporting young Australians who need a little bit of extra support to find their way in life. Worryingly, in the recent Senate estimates, we had it revealed that the government has not funded Youth Connections beyond 2014. And the head of department, Ms Lisa Paul, who gives very fulsome answers to very many questions, when asked about the need to address this, simply said, and it was prophetic in a way, that is a matter for government. It is a matter for government. It's a matter of importance for government. And it's a matter of importance for the young people who are the beneficiaries of the Youth Connections program. We established it because we believe that the government does have a role to provide support for the most vulnerable of young people falling through the cracks. Youth Connections' mission is to assist young people who are finding it difficult to cope with education and are not currently in training or work, and to help them focus on their future and help them guide them towards further study or training in their desired field. It's been a hugely successful program. It involves over 67 organisations across 113 service regions right across the country and employs 750 specialised youth workers. And when speaking to these youth workers, you really start to understand the level of skill and expertise and the communities of care that have wrapped around the kids because of the commitment of ongoing funding to this program. Youth Connections caseworkers work with young people to develop a formal plan for their future, in education and training or employment or both. The mentorship is an important element of the program, helping participants overcome the barriers they face, especially as many come from disadvantaged backgrounds. And in my many visits to the Youth Connections program on the Central Coast, I have to say so many wonderful memories. But to meet men who were tradespeople, highly qualified tradespeople who could be out making an awful lot of money, decide that they'd got a hand up by somebody else and they wanted to contribute to the life of these kids, generous in nature, powerful in their communication, mentoring and guiding these young men and women in how to rebuild their lives while they taught them the skills of actually physically building. To get the right person to do that job is no small thing. And what we are on the edge of, because of a failure of this government to declare that they will support it, is the complete dismantling of a highly skilled and very effective sector of youth workers who are helping rebuild the lives of kids who did not get off to a good start in their life. Now, providers are community-based. They're mostly not-for-profits with intimate knowledge of the local area, and they're really delivering Youth Connections programs very effectively. The Senate Estimates Education officials informed us that Youth Connections had a success rate of 75%, with participants either achieving or working towards a full final outcome. And the great thing was, those who had achieved a return to school or a placement, 93% of them were still in that school placement or learning placement or work 1 year on. That is a powerful indicator of how good this program is. 74,000 young people helped between 2010 and 2013. We know that 20% of the profile of Youth Connections clients are Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander kids, and making the success of this program for them is another step in closing the gap. It's our job in our time to make sure that we do that. We can't do it by pulling support from the most vulnerable. I do want to put on the record my concern that the evaluation report into the National Partnership on Youth and Attainment was released in December 2012 and showed an increase, but we haven't been able to actually get a more recent report, at least not published. And I'm concerned that it's on the record that it was available in January this year, but it's still not available to the public, because the public deserves to have this information of the success of this program. Just to give a detailed insight into the life of one young person who has been helped by Youth Connections, and I want to put on the record that the person's name and the places that are mentioned here have been changed to preserve their anonymity. I want to talk about Kate. Kate experienced severely dysfunctional upbringing, experienced physical, emotional and sexual abuse from a very young age, domestic violence from both her mother and father, witnessed a sexual assault from a mother to her sisters, and obviously witnessed drug use throughout her life. She was disconnected from her family at age 11, and although she was placed in the custody of her grandfather, there was still ongoing conflict, and she'd been in and out of home since the age of 13. Her father had spent the majority of his life in prison, and despite years of abuse and neglect, Kate still seeks and holds a very strong relationship with her father. Her older sister has also been in and out of prison for drug use and assault, and for her survival she engaged in prostitution. Kate would babysit her sister's children while this was happening. At the age of 14, this is the sort of person I'm talking about who's getting the funding from Youth Connections and getting support. At the age of 14, Kate engaged with a casework team through a referral from her school. She'd been, after that, proactive in asking for support and aiming towards what she wanted to achieve. Now, in mid last year, she was referred into a living skills program to help her move towards independent living. She completed the course over a six-week period, and the organisation that she was placed with was so impressed with her that they gave an interview to her for a housing program. The caseworkers then advocated for Kate because she was only 15, but they helped her negotiate and sign a lease to give her a safe home to go to, perhaps for the first time in her life. With the support of the caseworkers and this well-devised plan and support, Youth Connections was able to encourage a partnering organisation to be the guarantor on Kate's lease until she turned 16, and she is still successfully maintaining her rental, continuing the program till 2014, when she'll be skilled enough, based on her track record, to maintain her own accommodation and a job. And she belongs to a community of care now, with people in the community who are looking out for her. ACOS stated that the government must urgently signal its ongoing commitment to fund vital services which assist vulnerable and disadvantaged members of the community, including those which prevent homeless and address youth unemployment. Surely Youth Connections is one of those programs that deserves a place in the budget. It's 8 weeks to the budget. It's 5 more days of debating here in the Parliament. When are we going to hear a compassionate response from this government to those in great need? When are we going to see this outstanding program get the attention that it deserves and the funding that it needs to continue to do its work for the most vulnerable and needy young people in our community? With youth unemployment remaining stubbornly high, you'd think that this government would be racing to continue funding of such successful programs. You'd think that they would be there before we could even raise the question of, do you intend to review your decision around Youth Connections? We really seriously have to question the sort of motives that are at play at the moment in the Coalition's decision-making. The overwhelming body of evidence backs the critical importance of completing Year 12 and making a successful transition into work or study. And it shows that by doing so we reduce the lifetime risk of unemployment, ill health and boosts lifetime's earnings. I fear that in an ideological pursuit for smaller government, there's a meanness that will relegate our young people to a small future. It's time to break free of this self-imposed ideological straitjacket and give the young people of Australia an opportunity.